Hello, my name is Dan Klimek with Sisk and Company, and for this safety meeting we're going to talk a quick little overview of confined spaces. Now, your company needs to have a confined space program or a confined space awareness program. The material I'm going to cover today is only going to be a very quick overview of some of the things that are most likely in the program that your company has. On a typical confined space, the kinds of things we want to emphasize. You never enter a confined space unless you've been properly trained and you know your procedure. That any employee who is entering a space needs to know the dangers and needs to follow the procedures that your company has established, and that you need to comply with any kind of entry procedure or entry permit that you guys have. So again, those entry permits are really critical. One of the key things for identifying a confined space is that it's an enclosure that is large enough to get into. Any part of the body that breaks the plane of the opening is considered entry. That the space is not designed for continuous human occupancy, and it has limited means of entry and egress. If you have any kind of a space that fits that characteristics, it's going to be a confined space. Typically, we're looking at things like tanks, other kinds of vessels, trenches, maybe other kinds of tanks, those type of things that'll fit that kind of a definition. So when we start to look at this limited entry and egress, the kinds of things that you'll typically see is these things will have a manhole or some other kind of a small door. Most likely they're a hatch or the doors are bolted shut. There may be ladders or other kinds of things inside, or again, something like a long tunnel where you go in on one side and a very long depth. Those can all be considered confined spaces. The reason that a confined space is so dangerous is because we never know what the atmospheric hazard is going to be. So the reason you would have a permit system is to really make sure that you've identified the hazards in those spaces and you've taken action to control those hazards. So some of the questions you might ask is there an actual or potential atmospheric hazard? That's always the biggest concern. If there's standing water, there's other kinds of gases, people are using other kinds of chemicals or something in these spaces, the contaminants can build and oxygen can be depleted. And at some point, you'll go in there and not realize just how dangerous that is. And you may take just a couple of breaths and it's all over. So the atmospheric hazard is absolutely critical to understand in a confined space. In addition to that, we also have situations where there can be engulfment hazards, there's loose material. This might be bins or kind of silos or whatever where you have sand, other kinds of fracking materials, or even on a farm where you have grains or other type of food products that are stored. So engulfing hazards, you go into the space, some kind of a large bank, things can slough down, they'll cover you up, there's no way to get out. Another thing you can have is just some other serious health and safety hazard. These might be things like augers or other kinds of equipment. Now, one of the worst things that I've seen is somebody will go into a confined space and they will use chemical cleaners or other kinds of products. And remember we talked about those atmospheric hazards? Limited ventilation. At this point, those people have brought their own hazards in. They might be welding, they might be using other heat-producing things, they might be bringing in chemicals that are toxic, and they have no plan for how to contain that hazard. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of an atmospheric hazard in a confined space. The other type of hazards are real, and you need to watch them, but that atmospheric hazard is something that probably kills the most people. So when we start looking at an atmospheric hazard, it's important that you use a monitor to actually look at what are the contaminant levels that I face. So you want to look at oxygen content, you want to look at flammable gases, and you want to look at two toxics. Most of the time, at least from the businesses I work with, we're going to be looking at carbon monoxide and hydrogen sulfide. So those are the things you're going to want to take a look at. Again, you can also have other atmospheric hazards built with chemical fumes or the fact that there's liquids in the tank and you're doing things to disturb those liquids and they're off-gassing. So that atmospheric hazard is always a concern. Engulfing hazards, we've talked about that real quickly, about the idea of loose materials. You go in, it looks like it's fine. You start to walk into the tank, you disturb something at the bottom, and the truth of the matter is what's holding the stuff up next to that wall is the stuff at the bottom. You start to disturb that, that whole wall sloughs down, you get covered. It may be a half hour before they find you. You can't breathe, you're suffocated, and you tend to be crushed. So the basics of atmospheric testing is you need to understand how to use the meter. You need to be trained in using the meter. And you need to make sure your meters are calibrated and that they're actually responding the way they should. When you're doing air checks, you want to keep in mind that atmospheric hazards are based on the density of the contaminant or the gas that you're concerned with. Sometimes they're going to be low. Sometimes they're going to be mid-range. Sometimes they're going to be high. When you go in and start to disturb things, you can get enough air currents in there that you mix that up. So when you do air monitoring, sample low, sample mid-range, sample high to make sure you know what you have. You want to test for oxygen first, then test for flammable gases, and then the toxics. You want to control your space. This should be something that is done. Go around and look at where do we have confined spaces, and then make sure we put signs up that say danger, confined space, do not enter, or permit entry only, or whatever. The idea is we want to warn people, because even though you may know what a confined space is, not everybody does. We want to keep people out of spaces. To control atmospheric hazards, we want to get rid of things. We want to isolate, blank off lines, and we want to use ventilation. Those are absolutely key to maintain or to control those atmospheric hazards. We always want to eliminate the physical hazards. This might be things like the augers or other pieces of equipment. So lockout, tagout, following those procedures, de-energizing things, those are just steps that we need to do to be safe. So to review, you want to be aware of what a confined space is. As you're doing your work and you're proceeding into an area, use your JSA and identify confined spaces. Understand the hazards of a confined space and follow your company's procedures or guidelines for confined space entry, or maybe your procedure says we just want to identify them and we're going to stay away and let the owner of the tank know that that's a confined space, we can't go in and do the work. Whatever the case is, if you are going to enter a confined space, use air monitors. Make sure you're trained in how to use the monitor, record your readings, and make sure the monitor is working how it should be working. And again, follow all your confined space permit procedures. This presentation is available at www.gomsca.org.